Welcome, everybody. Good morning if you're on the West Coast, maybe good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, and almost good evening if you're in Europe like me. Please do, if you can find the chat at the bottom of your Zoom window, tell us where you're dialing in from. I'm in England, right down in the very bottom corner near to France, as close as you could be, I would say. So I'm going to put England right now into the chat, but tell us where you're dialing in from. In a moment, I'll come to my speakers and ask them where they're from. Just before we went on air, we were talking about relocation and all that kind of stuff. So be nice to see where everybody's dialing in from. We always have LA people dialing in. That's nice to see. South Virginia, very good. I'm sure I'll keep an eye on that as we keep going. What we're doing today, I'm going to give you a quick rundown. So, Spencer, if we could, let's go to the next slide with a couple of agenda points and we can get on with the show. Today, we are aiming for about 45 minutes of content. There'll be a Q&A at the end. I will call out for you as well. If you've got the chat open, that's a good place to have any questions and thoughts and comments, discussions throughout. The best place if you have a question that you really want answered at the end is the Q&A box. It's a couple to the right of where the chat box is, if you can see it in your Zoom at the bottom of the screen. So that's the best place for that, and we will do that near the end of the show today. So please don't think that we're ignoring you. We're saving it for the end. Second point I always get asked is when and will there be a recording of the event? It will come to you tomorrow by email. And apart from that, we are good to go. So can I go to my next slide, please, Spencer? Thank you, sir. So what we're doing today, the manufacturing shift, how technology is accelerating production. I am not the expert here today. This is going to be a minimal piece of talking and speaking from me. We're going to go to Aditya and Spencer. So Aditya, tell us, give us a bit of background. Tell us where you're calling in from. Did I get? I was kind of my headphones were messing up. Where did you say you've been back and forth across the country all week, or
Yeah,
have I
so
completely missed that?
live in Atlanta, but like work out of New York pretty often. So in New York right now. But yeah, background. Grew up in Atlanta. Went to Georgia Tech. If there's any Georgia Tech folks on the line, and then ended up working at Deloitte in their like smart factory groups. Worked on the factory floor, actually building some predictive maintenance solutions for a few customers. Then worked in the sort of industrial tech venture game for a little bit where I invested in early stage startups, and then led innovation at Norfolk Southern, and now lead business development at Iron Loop, who is a startup that is focused on compliance and cybersecurity for manufacturers across the country. So yeah, that's the quick life story and background.
Very good. Thank you for being here. We appreciate it. Can't wait to see what you got to say later on. Spencer, welcome, sir. How you doing?
I am great, Ollie. Thanks for asking. And hello everyone in the chat. I'm calling in from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Um, and yeah, so I've been at UpKeep for about 5 years. I build product here, which means I kind of help build the different features and stuff that you may or may not be using. I've built products for about 10 years now for a variety of different startups. Mostly in the sort of industrial space around supply chain, manufacturing, that kind of stuff. So yeah, super excited to be here today.
Very good. Well, I think maybe we can crack on, Spencer. I think I'm going to pass to you if you're ready to go. So, show's yours. I'm here if you need me, but let's do this.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you very much, Ollie. All right. Well, thanks everyone again for being here. I'm really excited for this conversation with Aditya. So just to kick things off, the topic for today is spending on technology. Where are things actually delivering? What's working? What's not working? We're thinking about, roughly the scope of the past 10 years. So as you guys are thinking through some of these things and interacting with us, keep roughly that scope in mind. Of course, it doesn't need to be exactly 10 years. But we'll kick things off with a live poll. Hit us up in the Zoom chat and let us know over that last 10 years-ish or so, you guys have been spending on different technologies to help sort of like deliver outcomes, in your plants. What's working? What's working, and particularly where have things delivered the least? Visibility and data dashboards, automation AI pilots, standardization across plants, workflow capability, knowledge transfer, or maybe it hasn't stalled for you. So pick one of the five answers, or if it's answer number six, let us know what you think about that question. And while folks are answering there in the chat, I'm curious, Aditya, what you've seen. You've spent a lot of time walking the floor with all sorts of different companies and seen a lot of stuff. And what are you seeing? What's working? What's not working?
I think there's a lot of solutions that have kind of like been sold and built in the category, like across predictive maintenance. like OEE, quality control. And so like those solutions that I think have worked are those solutions that have really embedded in the workforce and like really like focused on change management and adoption, rather than the technology. Like I think, in my mind at least, technology is an enabler of value. The value doesn't accrue as a result of the technology. And so like it is that like workforce enablement. And so those companies that are doing that and focusing that and like driving engagement from users across different personas. So, operators, supervisors, plant managers, all the way up to larger enterprises with VPs of ops, like those are the folks that have been successful. And that's why you've seen like those, let's say, startups or companies like, actually prove to become like large businesses and have demonstrable outcomes for a lot of folks. So yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah. All right, interesting kind of mix in the plant. So in the chat, some folks saying automation AI pilots have sort of delivered the least, a little bit of workflow, force capability, knowledge transfer. So excited to dig in. Let's kind of keep that in mind as we move forward. So let's kind of dig in a little bit in terms of like where we see again like technology, that technology spectrum. What are things that we're seeing? Hey, technology has come in and started to solve in really a meaningful way. And what hasn't it solved? I've got some stuff here on the screen, but again, Aditya would love to kind of take your lead here in terms of what you're seeing, hardware, software, what's being solved and what sort of has yet to be solved.
Yeah, so I mean, I think hardware and connectivity were like, OEE and visibility, all that stuff definitely was a commodity, but I think that's maybe changing now and like, sort of inverting where I actually think software is becoming a commodity with like Claude Code, Cursor, and some of these other tools that allow you to develop products a lot quicker and iterate on products a lot quicker. So like while that might not result in a production application, it does allow you to change and tune things much, much quicker. And so I think what it didn't solve though, coming back to kind of the earlier point, is that like change management and adoption of the technology. Um, AI has made it easier to capture new modalities of information. So think like voice, think text, think visual images, and like have that be part of a sort of graph of information that you as an enterprise has. But it like doesn't solve that like last mile, which is like the actual like driving value on the shop floor. And so like I don't think like it has solved that, nor is continuing to like solve that even with AI and the new tools that exist.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. So what I'm hearing is, over it's the hardware piece has become cheaper, more accessible. Software's become more accessible, but kind of like how do you actually take those advancements and turn them into real value that sort of gets delivered and I guess kind of like that judgment kind of sits in that last mile. Um,
Yeah, I
interesting.
mean, I think yeah, I think it's just like embedding into the workflow a lot more. Like I mean, just some of the experience I had deploying OEE dashboards and like building a predictive maintenance solution at Deloitte, like the value really accrued when like we had the operators and supervisors at this injection molding facility, like after we started to engage right with the product. It wasn't the fact that we built like a vibration frequency based model. It was just the fact that like those folks started to like want to drive value with the product and like that's that last mile that I think like is going to consistently need to be there, even with like agents and whatever buzzword or AI you want to sort of throw out there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that kind of speaks to a little bit of this piece here around like judgment, like, here we kind of we're positing that some of the things that don't get solved are like how do we capture the fact that at the end of the day, like you still have people, right? And people have variety, from one plant to the next and behave differently. No two people work kind of exactly the same. And it does make it hard to implement process or like what about all that information that lives in people's heads that really never makes it into the system. I am curious to hear like what's your thoughts on you mentioned AI sort of allowing for new modalities, speech to text, being able to sort of like ramble and have sort of unstructured information turned into something that's maybe like fits the structure of a tool. Where do you kind of see that in terms of like, is that actually making a difference, for folks? Where are we kind of on the curve of people adopting that and applying it?
I mean, I think it depends on the use case, right? And domain, right? Like I think you're seeing a lot more of that in like, let's say remote asset management, field service. right? Where like you've gone out to a site, you've done some sort of fix, and you need to record information quickly that like can then feed back into an EAM, right? Or some or like a product akin to that. And I think like you're seeing value there. And so on like maybe the voice side, but then on the like image side, like document capture, sort of recounting a process side, I think you're starting to see that on like within the four walls of the factory, right? With some of these like workforce enablement sort of programs and like digital transformation programs where you've got this retiring workforce and you need to capture their information. And so I think, at least from what I've heard from a few manufacturers like that I've interviewed as part of my newsletter that I also write, like that seems to be an interesting use case where they're seeing like an uptick in leveraging some of these AI tools.
Yeah, interesting. Uh, I feel like kind of what we're dancing around here is like technology, like we maybe don't really have a technology problem, right? Like hardware is more accessible than ever. Software is becoming more and more commoditized. Like really like the problem is how do we get that last mile? Like how do we get people to use the technology? How do we capture this like unstructured human judgment, capture the difference in the way people work? Does that kind of feel fair to you?
Totally. I mean, if you even look at like, AI, like the huge LLM craze we've got now, like the value is really accrued with these businesses that have created harnesses around their tech, right? Like, and that is that judgment, right? That is that context. That is the stuff that like the technology doesn't have and solve and that you need to kind of continue to work with. And like, again, I think it comes back to what you said, Spencer, which is just like that judgment, that taste, that like insight, that nuance, like that is key. And then like that engagement on that information then drives like value with those with whatever companies are trying to deploy tech. So yeah.
Yeah, cool. Cool. Let us know what you think in the chat. Like, I'm gonna kind of move on to the next slide here, but would love to hear people's takes. Let us know how you're feeling about this. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of like how this actually plays out, right? Like, especially for folks who are operating multiple plants. And we see this all the time at UpKeep, and I'm sure you see it all the time in the market at detail. Like, you run into situations where you've got relatively identical equipment. You're producing the same products on relatively the same equipment. You have, in theory, the same setup, right? You're running the same PMs, you're measuring the same things, and yet two plants can achieve wildly different outcomes, right? So kind of before I dig into this, I want to open it back up to a poll here and would love to hear from folks. How much are you guys seeing is that gap here between your best and worst performing plants? Like, is it in that like less than 10% range, 10 to 25%, 25 to 50? Maybe you aren't measuring this or you don't really have a good picture of this. Would be fascinating to understand. Let us know kind of what your lived experience is. And kind of while those results are coming in, yeah, I want to hit on some of the outcomes that we see here. So, unexplained performance spreads. Again, we see this all the time. Identical setups, different performance. And I think for us, like variance, like where is that driven from? And our hypothesis is it's not like you are a bad plant. It's the difference in judgment, right? Different people operating different machines, different levels of seniority and things like that. And when we think about, headcount and portfolio as people retire, in one plant in isolation, one retirement event, HR event, right? We throw a party, we say goodbye. But over time, over 15 plants and 14 years, all those retirements really kind of lead to a bit of a P&L problem, right? How do we replace not just the people, but the knowledge? If someone spent 30 years working on a machine, all the things they've learned over those 30 years, like how do we capture that? And then, how do we actually measure the cost of this? So, what one thing y'all can consider a little bit is like when we think about that knowledge gap, how many hours are your techs losing to trying to search for knowledge, troubleshoot issues that maybe a more experienced mechanic would understand? How many techs do you have? What's your hourly rate? Multiply that by 52 weeks in a year, and the number of plants you have, and it really does start to kind of become a big story around like the cost of this knowledge gap and the fact that maybe we're not doing such a great job of capturing that human judgment and context. All right. So looking here in the chat, yeah, 10 to 20, 35, 10, 20. So, it's certainly not, it's not huge, but it's not unremarkable either, right? There's definitely kind of something here. Aditya, curious, like if you're sort of seeing if you're seeing these things play out in the market, what your take is on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this has been like a consistent theme for a while, right? Like this whole like silver tsunami sort of, framing has been there for a long time. And I think like it's an interesting way to sort of quantify value, right? Is like this annual cost of the knowledge gap. I think like the next phase of that ends up becoming like tying it to a specific process, so that you're able to like actually say like, because I was able to get said insight quicker, like the output of that is like, greater efficiency or yield or whatever, like for like a specific line or process. And so I think to me, like that is like, I think, how you turn like maybe cost savings or efficiency savings into like measurable ROI, for customers. So yeah, and I would say like just maybe from my experience really briefly at Norfolk Southern, which is a huge railroad, like they were going to build a bunch of these agents internally, and like, the business case, like as the CFO would, speak to it, was really on that last piece, right? Like turning the efficiency number into something that is like really measurable for that workflow. So yeah.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I think it's so important to measure, like to have some framework to measure. Like we're trying all these things. I talk to all sorts of customers here at UpKeep who are, trying a variety of things to try, and like drive again better outcomes, right? Ultimately, whatever that means, like better OEE, more profit, whatever it might be. And but it's important to have like those like markers along the way. Like, are we actually like getting out of this like what we're hoping to get out of it? So I do like that framework of like that cost of the knowledge gap.
Totally, because like, inputs are easier to measure and also easier to gamify from an incentive perspective, right, in the workforce, but the
Yeah.
outputs are usually more concrete. So yeah.
Cool. I want to hit on this like second, this retirement idea. This is the thing that I hear, hearing again. I feel like it's just like a story that I hear, and I'm curious, what you're seeing. I'd love to hear from y'all in the chat. Like, I do often hear this story of like, our workforce is aging. Folks are retiring out, and it's harder than ever to hire, younger talent like into that. There's fewer people interested in these types of jobs. Like, but I don't know. Like, I'm curious. Has that played out? Have you seen that play out, Aditya? Like folks in the chat, are you guys seeing that playing out? Does that resonate for you?
I mean, I would say like I think it depends, right? Like there is a I think it's company dependent, right? And like,
Yeah.
field dependent, locale dependent. I think it's easy to sort of, apply it broadly to the entire
Yeah.
United States.
Yeah.
I think like technology serves an opportunity to entice younger workers, right? And bring them into the fold, like that like creates excitement, and that allows them to think about ways to improve process. And so that's one way. I think the
Mm,
second way where like I think you're starting to see a younger set of folks kind of enter the workforce is a lot of folks that want to become owner operators, right? And want to introduce technology into the processes or the shops that they are looking to own. And so like you're seeing a lot of young folks enter in that way. And then the third piece is I think you're seeing a lot of tech and younger folks maybe in the early stage, like venture backed ecosystem, right? Where these folks are looking to start with like a hybrid hardware software approach. So, I
mm.
think you are seeing green shoots of young folks like in and around the economy. And it's not all bad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. All right, I'm gonna kind of move us on here to our next slide. So I want to dig into, we talked about that last mile, that last 10%, and how do we take the fact that software, hardware is becoming more commoditized than ever, and yet like there, how do we actually drive value from these tools? There's more tools than ever, more softwares than ever. How do we drive value? And I want to talk about like the resistance points, right? And the different personas maybe at play here, and what we can learn from that. So on one hand we've got corporate finance kind of at the highest level who are thinking about this ROI, right? They're thinking about, we're going to go spend time and money to implement something, and sometimes we might get blocked on like wanting to understand the ROI before we scale something, and maybe not having the right ways to measure it. On the plant leadership level, right? We have an understanding that from plant to plant, like of course things operate differently. Everyone wants, some amount of autonomy because of course, again, we're all just people working through these problems together, and people are different. So, we got plant leadership. My plant's different. Frontline techs who, I speak to techs all the time who, they want to spend time working on equipment, right? Like that's their superpower is like something went down, I came in, I saved the day, right? Or hopefully I prevented something from going down tomorrow by the work I did today. Like entering data into whatever system, like that doesn't feel like I'm generating value, right? To someone who's used to turning a wrench, right? This is just more paperwork. And then IT, OT, who are sort of being asked, like, hey, integrate this, integrate that, integrate this, stand up this system, administer this, and sort of burn out of like, that's just another system. So I'm curious, Aditya, like which of these four, or maybe again it's option five, which of these four are you seeing that sort of kill um, kill initiatives most often, and maybe throughout the life cycle of an initiative, it's different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends, right? I think it's just a typical sort of consulting answer, but like on the short on the short term, or in the short term at least, like it is corporate and finance, right? Like you can run a bunch of pilots, but if you don't, show and prove ROI for said use case quickly and effectively, like nothing is going to move forward, at least at maybe larger scale, like the operations, and I think that's like an important thing to focus on and consistently focus on, as you think about some of these initiatives. In the long term, though, I think it becomes like how you think about change management and enablement and adoption, right? And like finding those champions and finding those folks that are going to engage with the product consistently, and also like measuring that. Right. Like, I think like you want people that are constantly interacting with the product on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Right. And you want to see that consistent like growth from like that like product collect growth sort of mindset from software. You want that, right? And you want, as an example, like, if a new employee joins a company and they're like quick to onboard onto the product or the platform or the sort of initiative that you're working on, and they're excited about it and they take that on themselves, like that is a good signal for the initiative, right? And so, like long term, I think that's what you're trying to like optimize for, because if you do that, the ROI that you've already proven out should theoretically continue to be there. So, like that, I think is like maybe how at least I've thought about it, and actually what I've seen on the inside at a company like Norfolk Southern, or even in some of the projects I did with Deloitte, like that's the balance you have to strike, right? As you think about some of these like push points, or points of resistance.
Yeah. Would love to hear from folks in the chat, like if you have a perspective here of what you're seeing, within your own organizations. Is it corporate finance, plant leadership, frontline techs, IT, OT? I think like I'll kind of share an example of here at UpKeep. We really have tried to tackle the sort of frontline techs. Like, when UpKeep originally started, we started as like a mobile first CMMS, and really the purpose of that was to give, those frontline techs a tool that met them where they were on the go. And I do think it's interesting that that's changing now, right? Like there's like kind of an app for everything. And so, I think we're thinking a lot about like, what's that next paradigm of how do we continue to cut down barriers between the user, that person that does have that judgment in their head, and how do we get them to document stuff or get that information somewhere at some point. We're going to talk a little bit later about kind of how we think about laying that foundation. But I really think driving adoption of like the people who actually kind of have that knowledge in their head and are doing the work. I think that can be the one of the biggest challenges that we run into at UpKeep, and that we hear from the folks that we work with.
Yeah, I mean, Michael made a point in the chat. It's like the older techs, and I like for sure experienced that at Deloitte. Like I was responsible for deploying some of the solutions in the factory floor and got pushback from the older techs. But I think it's just like I spent a lot of time with them and like really worked to like drive, engagement with those folks. And I think to Spencer's point, like, that piece and like solving that, maybe even with some of these modalities that we talked about earlier, right? Where it's now easier for them to be able to keep doing what they're doing, but also provide the data that's critical to drive value, is a way to hopefully try to engage them in different ways. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And Chris kind of mentioned again, like the feeling that it's just more paperwork or I'm just being like surveyed, right? Someone is just like micromanaging what I'm doing. And, I think what I see is like across an organization, it's really not about that, right? It's more about that. How do we capture, what's happening on the floor and then use that data to inform strategic decisions. But I think there's a piece here which is like, how do we tell our team that story, right? Like it's one thing to kind of believe that at a systems level, but then how do you communicate that to, yeah, your aging tech or even just your tech who's like, yeah, get out of my way. Like I'm just trying to work. And that's a genuinely hard problem. It's like it's part culture, it's part software, it's part personality, right? So it's a tough one. And
Yeah, it's kind of like this dual top-down, bottoms-up approach, right? Like where you want them to try to engage, but you want them to feel like they have a say in how the product is
yes.
getting built and how it fits their workflows, right? And so like making sure that they feel that like, buy-in, I think is really important. And like I think as an example, like of a customer, an injection molding facility in PA that I went to, like they were so top down that like provided like a lot of friction for a lot of the operators. And like we tried to in our sort of project with them, like really bring operators into the fold, into those conversations with senior leaders and like provide a perspective to like create that communication, and like try to remove like maybe sometimes can come across as like disjointed nature of like I wanted to throw tech down to the shop floor and they're like I've got enough going on. So anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Um, Okay, I think that leads nicely kind of into our next slide here, which is, when we do think about implementing some change here, like how do we lead? Do we lead with the tool or do we lead with the process? So I'll kind of throw two options out here and then would love to hear your take, Aditya. Option one, like single plant approach first, right? Take one plant as a pilot, solve that process problem for them, create a playbook, and then go to the next 14, right? And say, hey, here's the playbook, go run it. Versus, an option that's like, hey, okay, you got 15 plants, give them the tool and let them sort of use the tool, follow the least path of resistance, define some process, and then sort of share the best across that 15. So sort of like, do we try and do 15 all at once or really go deep on one, and then apply those learnings? What's your take in terms of what do you think works better here?
I actually think it's like a third choice, right? Like I've given you a lot of depends answers, and I'm giving you another one, but like, I think it's like a third choice, right? I think in my mind, like what is the most effective is, and what from what I've seen is like you compare two plants side by side, right? Like, you earlier in the call like talked about every plant might have maybe the same structure imposed upon them for a specific process, but like they have the different workflows, they have different operating cadences, they have different metrics. Like I think to really see the efficacy of the product and like a tool, you should compare two plants side by side to account for that variability, right? And like that allows you to come up with like a better sense of like, what is effective across your network, right? Another example is like, if you deploy like an OE solution and you don't have them be a unified like, data structure. Like you might have two different plants that have two different ways of naming the same assets that are being used to produce a specific good. Like that is important to sort of try to suss out too with the product, right? Like component, subcomponent, all the way down to the IO itself. So like, I think like these are ways that you can like really compare across process maturity and then also like technical maturity and workflow maturity and like see the value of a product. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And I of course love the it depends answer.
Yeah,
And I'm with you in that like, I've seen a variety of different, organizations. Some where like that OE example I think is like perfect, right? Somewhere it's like they've got things figured out. It's like here's our like failure modes and there's like 20 of them and
sure.
everyone knows and they use the same. And then I talk to companies who are like, yeah, people just like type stuff on a work order and we try and make sense of it, right? And it's like, oh, okay. So depending on kind of where you are, I'm with you. It's gonna depend, like how you approach this is going to change. Like, I think one framework that I kind of consider is like, what how similar are the processes? Like, are you currently in a state where you do have like 15 plants with 15 different processes, in which case like solving one plant's process like maybe does like very little to solve, two, three, four, five through 15. But if you are already in a state where at least in theory you have a map of process, like then kind of deploying across multiple plants helps tease out, hey, where's that process actually failing, right? Because again, best laid plans, you've got your list of 20 failure modes, but are people actually using them? Like, is that being captured on the floor with those frontline techs? Like, I think it's, in that case, maybe it is like a tool first approach where you find the path of least resistance, and you kind of move from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think even to the question and poll earlier, right? Like 20%, 10%, 10 to 20%, right? Like everybody's saying like there is some variance, right, between plants. And so like I think like, if you were able to compare those two plants, like you might be, be able to actually see, where the value in aggregate might accrue right across the network. So yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Uh, just what coming to you on Chris's comment here in the chat, like reducing the pain points. Yeah, I love it. Like I think one thing, yeah, I see is like, trying to tease out those pain points sooner than later, and then like you said, Chris, like delivering on it, right? Go talk to the text, figure out like what are the real pain points, and if you can then deliver a process or a tool that solves that, for example, hey, I we're always out of this part, right? We always need it, and we never have it in stock, and that makes me look bad. It makes maintenance look bad when like we can't solve the problem, but really it's a parts problem, right? We never have whatever the bearing that we need. So and then if we can frame it as like, okay, hey, well, if we use a tool that captures our part consumption, that allows us to get ahead of stockouts and things like that. I think I love that sort of carrot and stick analogy where it's like, but if you get the carrot of like you're going to get your part, but the stick is like, well, you do have to use the thing, that we're trying to implement here. You do have to use the tool in order to get that carrot. Okay, cool. I'm gonna move on here to kind of this foundation layer, and here I'll kick things off and then hand it to you to hear your thoughts, Aditya. So I think at Upkeep we think about, and just in general in the industry, whatever system, whatever tool, there's sort of three pieces of a foundation that we think about. Number one, think about how we capture a point of work. I spend a lot of my day in meetings and be like, hey, follow up on this, follow up on that, and if I wait until the end of my day to go back and kind of think about what I did or document it, like stuff just leaves my brain, right? There's so much input throughout the day, and I think like I'm at my best when I'm able to, quickly, document what's happening as it's happening. And I think about the same for techs, those frontline tech workers or really anyone. Like we like to think that we can remember all this stuff and we can remember feelings and stuff, but those details start to slip, especially if you have a 7 a.m. meeting and then like five more, or a 7 a.m. inspection of a machine, right? If you don't get around to documenting what you noticed until 4 p.m., right before you're ending your shift, like there's so much that just gets kind of lost to time and maybe your brain kind of remembers it subconscious. But so capturing at point of work. And then number two, connecting that back to the asset. So, having some system where you can capture insight and then connect that insight back to a specific asset, whether that asset is a building, a vehicle, a machine, whatever that might be. And then figuring out how do we surface that before it's needed. So kind of again going back to this like example of like the parts, right? Capturing at point of work what parts are being used, connect that back to that asset, and then surface before we run out of time that hey, you have so many of this part in stock. You've got 5 PMs over the next 6 months. Surface, you need to buy more of this now so you don't run out in 3 months, 6 months, whatever it might be. So it's kind of the 1, 2, 3 foundation that we think about laying, and that we talk to folks that come into the Upkeep ecosystem about trying to implement within their organization. Curious how this maps to what you're seeing out there in the market, Aditya. If you would add to this at all or take away from it, maybe.
No, I mean, I think this makes sense. I think, like this is very sort of tech oriented, right? Like I think underneath these three sort of boxes, there is like a sort of unifying box of like people and workflow,
Yes.
right? And like I think that is important. Like that is also part of the foundation here. Otherwise, you start to focus on like how do you drive and enable and force tech, right? Versus like how do you empower the workforce to use the tech? And I think that framing is like important, right? As you think about building this foundation.
Totally, totally. And we've kind of I've talked a little bit like I think especially on that first point, the like what I've loved about AI and starting to see it get more and more adopted. I think we still have a ways to go, but what I love about AI is the ability to capture things in like a much looser, unstructured way. You know, like I used to spend days at a time like sitting at a computer typing out like these long documents about like how we should build a software feature. I think similarly like you could spend a ton of time filling out a paper checklist and like a billion and you know picking a bunch of different different failure modes and codes and et cetera, et cetera. But I think now more than ever we can do things like ramble, for 10 minutes, do a voice memo, right? Where maybe I'm walking the line and LLMs are getting better and better at connecting that to, the type of structured data that we need to make it matter, for two and three. But sort of taking a little bit of that burden off of the input where the user doesn't have to answer a 20-page checklist and think about codes. Like they can talk about it and you've got LLMs that can map that to like, oh, Spencer said it was like squeaky joint on this thing, like that's whatever, we know that that's this type of failure code, and then we know that it requires this type of remediation, which is like about lubrication or something like that. So I really do think that the technology is going to start empowering more and more, especially that first step.
Yeah, and maybe adding to that point and maybe coming back to what we've talked about or like the recurring theme, it's like how you deploy that matters, right?
Mm,
Like
yeah.
it's like it's great that it can do that, but like how do you get that old tech to use it and what are the ways to incentivize him both strategically but also like, allow him to reduce the barrier to be able to communicate in that unstructured way, I think are important to like really drive home this
Yeah.
like layer,
And you kind of hit on this before. I'm curious, especially in this context, like when you talk about like, yeah, how do you actually implement that? I sort of see two different options here. Is it a top down or a bottom down approach, right? Do you sort of start with sort of the corporate level, leadership level mandate of like, hey, we're going to do this, or do you sort of like give your team the tool and let them kind of earn it and let them define, hey, this is how we'd like to work, and have it be a little top down. I'm guessing maybe there's an it depends here, but
I
curious.
think it's both. Like, I think
Yeah.
it's never like it sucks when like, just being honest, it sucks when someone's like telling you what to do always, right? Like, I understand that like you need to have people to execute upon certain tasks effectively, but like, as you start to think about this stuff, like it's nice to be heard, as you
Yes.
sort of like start to adopt these workflows and tools. And so like I think it's just both, right? Like it ends up being like, you know, top down from a strategic direction ROI, like time boxing perspective, right? And like to measure the efficiency across your network or at a site or online, like, I think like that is important, but like the engagement with the product is really how you're going to be able to evaluate that ROI. And so that needs to be like, excitement driven from within, right? To want to use the product. Like I'll even take take us out of the manufacturing setting and even go back to some of my recent experience at Norfolk where like the CIO pushed cursor upon all the engineers, right? And like the engineers weren't excited about it because they were told I need to use cursor for coding and development. And it's like there were maybe a couple that were excited about it and they got engaged. But like until there was like a program and change management and systems and like there was a developer group and all this stuff, right, that exists, like until that point came, like everybody felt like they were being told to use a product, not empowered to use a product, And so, like, I think that piece is like, I think a core part of that, like, bottoms up feeling of excitement. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think one thing I've seen work, across all sorts of different tools, and I think kind of fits, bottoms up, but it could be bottoms up or top down, is like, when you do find that person, maybe it's a couple people who can kind of lead from from the front, who have kind of realized the value of a specific tool and sort of giving them a platform to say like, hey, look at what we can do here. And oftentimes I do find that comes more from the bottom down, right? Where like somebody plays, like you find your tinker or the person who like does want to mess around with the tool, and they find that like, oh wow, this is like fundamentally going to change the way I can work. Whether that's, a CMMS, a cursor, a coding tool, whatever it
Sure.
might be, right?
Yeah.
You find that person, but then you give them a platform to show other people. Because I'm with you in that, like, it sucks to be told you have to use this, but when you see your coworker, kind of like fall into this role within an org where now they have a platform to kind of talk about what matters to them, like that's really inspiring.
Yeah, and Chris hit on a point which I was going to add, which is like you need to find that champion, but that champion should be someone that, like Spencer just mentioned, that is that tinkerer that is interested, because like inherently they are going to be excited about both deploying the tech, but also like those people are kind of weirdly investing themselves into the company by doing that. Like they're very bought in because they want to drive value with the company, and so those are like great people to sort of identify and place in that champion role, right? Both from a like efficiency effectiveness of the deployment itself, but also from like a long-term like development and growth perspective and like, HR perspective of like having that person maybe grow up through the enterprise. So like I think, Chris, you made it important, but absolutely agree the champion is key, and identifying that champion is important.
Yeah, yeah, totally. Okay. uh, Kind of just want to. I think we've kind of covered some interesting examples, but want to like play this out in a customer that we've sort of seen some stories we've seen at UpKeep where how this sort of like capture, connect, and then surface thing kind of plays out. Where again, imagine a plant, a well-run plant. You've got standard PMs that are being completed. So you've got like PM compliance at 100%. Everyone seems like everything's going great on paper, but then the lived experience, the real outcome are like continued recurring unexplained failures. Dig into that, and what we found was, hey, the root cause is actually kind of this like this gap in like human judgment where you had an older sort of seasoned tech who understood the importance of lubrication, but that step wasn't documented. It was just like the kind of thing that they do, right? They maybe have like a 50 item checklist, and as they're doing that checklist, they're also just doing lubrication across that equipment. Maybe they stop doing it during a busy season for one reason or another, and sort of their replacement just sees like them not do it, right? And so now you've sort of lost that little bit of context to like history, right? Now that older tech has retired out, like that knowledge lives nowhere. But being able to sort of capture that. So like, how do we again capture that, right? Where if we give that tech a tool where they're not just constrained to like do exactly this 20 per thing checklist, and then like no way to sort of capture other stuff that they might be just doing and noticing on the fly. If you give them a place to capture that, again, connect it back to the record, and then surface that not only to them, but to the entire org, to the 14 other plants, where now, hey, we can update that PM to all 14 plants, and talk about the importance of that lubrication step. So kind of I want to like highlight this as a story, and then just highlight some of the key takeaways here. Again, separating hardware from human knowledge, like where we're at is it just does feel like a lot of the technology is there. Obviously, it's going to keep getting better, but a lot of the technology is there. Software is becoming more commoditized, hardware is becoming more commoditized, and yet we aren't seeing that drive the value that we feel like it should. And a lot of that depends on this like undocumented technician judgment, these people problems, these variants in peoples. And that kind of comes out in like performance spreads between identical plants. Use that again. Think about that metric of like hours lost to sort of like lack of technician knowledge. Think about that as potentially an ROI metric, and then think about in three, building that foundation: capture, connect, surface. Aditya, want to kind of give you the last word here, before we go to some follow-ups and next steps. The last word on maybe this framework. Anything else you feel like needs to be said?
I don't know. I mean, I think experimenting is the best. Like, if you're able to create a structure and an environment, both from a technical, like, data perspective, but then also from like a, like, operational sandbox perspective, like, I think those those often allow you to really like test your assumptions. And I think as you continue to deploy tech, I think that you should kind of create this environment to be able to do that effectively, even ahead of like an ROI or like business case conversation. So yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you. So just some next steps here. If you are interested in scheduling a 15-minute reliability audit, I think we'll send a link there. You can learn more at upkeep.com. There's a way to download the playbook. This executive playbook for kind of like some of the model that we've been talking about here behind the scenes. Go ahead and follow Aditya on Substack and LinkedIn. Maybe Aditya, you could post kind of some links here in the chat so folks can hear what you're up to and follow your journey. Next up, we're going to open it up for some Q&A. So I think Ollie, back to you. I'll keep showing my screen here, but back to you to moderate some Q&A. If folks can send their questions in the chat, we would love to hear from you.
Yes, sir. Okay, so I have one from a little earlier on. I think a few of us chimed in with some comments and thoughts. But now is the time, everyone. So if you see the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, if you have something, put it in there, and I'll pay attention to it. Failing that, the chat is the next best place. So I'll keep an eye. But if we don't see any, then we'll wrap up, and I'll let you know when you can get the recording. So the one that I had was, and I think I'll go to both of you with this. Everybody said, or most people said, that the hardest objections to handle can come from the text. That's what most people said. What can you do to ease that resistance? Who wants to take my difficult question first? No
I'm gonna
takers. I'll put Spencer under the bus.
I,
Sorry, sir.
yeah, no problem. I mean, I think it's a lot of kind of what we've said around like, finding champions, letting people experiment, right? Like I do think there's an element of like find the people who are willing to tinker with new software, new technology out there. Give them a way to show your company, hey, this is working. Like it worked for me. And then that's where the top down has to meet it, where like you have to then like support that champion, and help them realize that vision, right? Where like now they feel like, wow, like I had this idea, kind of I was able to make a material difference. So I really think that like giving people permission to play, to experiment with these things, and then finding the things that work, and then help kind of raise them up, to lead the charge is a good way to start.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think, echoing some of the themes that we talked through here today. On the ROI thing, maybe just because we haven't really touched on that too much, like I do think there like is, I don't know if people here are responsible necessarily for building a business case, but there is like, an addition of like just being mindful of timelines, right? Like this isn't like given the workflows and operations that everybody's built out, like things take time to change because you're changing human behavior to some extent. And so like just being mindful about how time box that ROI story and business case, I think is also important. Like I've seen situations and I've talked to if you both startup founders and also like buyers, and like I think they often be like, I need to see value in 2 months or 8 weeks, and it's like hard to see measurable change there. And so I think that's an important like sort of thing to consider as well as you try to address that maybe leg of the stool head on.
I like it. I'm going to go to a comment I saw from Alexis a little while ago and bring it back and maybe pick out a question from it. Often there can be too many platforms within each department, and then when you go to multi-plant, that kind of multiplies and becomes different. What experience or notes do we have about how to kind of bring that back in from being a loose, disparate puzzle to fix? How can we regain some control there?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to it maybe on the corporate side, from what I've seen. Like, I think that is a procurement problem, right? Like, that is a procurement structure problem where, in some large corporates, you have like a minimum threshold that you can sort of like hit with spend, and like I think you need to sort of dial in sort of yeah like spend on software, and like that I think is like the first place to start. The second place to start is like it comes down to just like you building an infrastructure maybe that is also a bit more modular, right? Like that allows you to like, port things over from platforms and be able to like, come back to a architecture like, taxonomy that is like consistent with what you have. And like that I think is like an important like part of that like IT/OT leg. And so like in my mind, like those two things like are important to dial in because they give you the flexibility maybe to move forward with new solutions should you want to try stuff out, but also give you this like sort of foundation for like spend in tech, which I think are, the drivers of that. But yeah.
I'll just add, I think Alexis, like, I wish there was a silver bullet. Like, that is a hard problem. Like, I can't think of someone I've talked to in any of my roles who hasn't kind of run into that problem, especially for folks who are running more than, like a multi-shop organization. I will say, like, I am so bullish about the future. I mean, we just with the rise of AI agents and MCP connectivity, like it's easier and easier for disparate softwares to talk to each other. And AI is getting better and better at, again, taking sort of different inputs and like making sense of them, right? Like unstructured inputs, but also just differences, right? Like think about like getting an export of like one parts like procurement software and another one like you could marry that maybe a lot easier with a lot of like what LMs are doing. Again, like I think like tools are evolving, and I'm very bullish about kind of what the future holds in terms of our ability to connect disparate systems in a way that makes sense and is accessible to more and more people.
Very good. All right, both. I'm going to call the session here. I'm going to quickly do some wrap up after we do a thanks and where could people find and follow you both. So I want to come to you first, Spencer. Where could people get in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, hit me up at UpKeep. You can just send me an email. I'd love to talk to literally anyone about anything, but especially product and kind of the problems you're up to. So I'm spencer.nelson@upkeep.com. You can find me on LinkedIn, follow me there. I'll be sharing like product updates in terms of like UpKeep in that place.
Very good. And I'll say, as the webinar runner, you kept us perfectly to time, which I always appreciate. So thank you and well done, sir. Aditya, how about you, sir? Where can people find and follow you?
Just LinkedIn, shoot me a note. If I can help connect you with anyone and everyone, let me know. I'm always happy to chat and riff on like ideas, share more anecdotes from what I've seen and connect you with cool people and companies that have done this before. So yeah, and then also if you're interested, feel free to subscribe. There's a newsletter, right, to about 3,700 folks in the manufacturing tech space on a weekly, bi-weekly basis with interviews. So stay engaged there if you're interested as well.
Very good. All right. Everyone knows where to go and get connected. Lastly, I will say the final thing, as I mentioned at the start too, we always get asked where will the recording come. That can come out tomorrow. So check your inbox for that. And while you're looking in your inbox, just keep your eye out and stay tuned for in the next couple of weeks, maybe even a month, almost to the day today. We're going to have our next webinar, and I'll whet your appetite just a little bit. It's going to be about AI and all things to do with AI. So I won't say any more. Keep your eyes out for that. With that, everybody, thank you very much for your time and patience and thoughts and questions. Alexis, I will drop you a note about the download there, so I'll get back to you on that. But that's the end of the show. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next one. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.